It was a chilly, mist-covered morning in March 2009 when Rhonda Casto left her Oregon apartment with her boyfriend, Stephen Nichols, and their 9-month-old daughter. The plan was simple, just a short hike through the scenic trails of Eagle Creek, a spot the couple had visited before, nestled in the Columbia River Gorge, known for its waterfalls, towering cliffs, and sudden drop-offs. But by sunset, everything had changed. 23-year-old Rhonda, vibrant, funny, full of ambition, was gone. Her body found at the bottom of a steep ravine, her life suddenly cut short on a trail meant to be peaceful and quiet. It was a fall, Stephen told authorities, a horrible, tragic accident. But as the days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into years, cracks began to show in Stephen's version of events. Cracks that raised one haunting question. Was this truly an accident, or something much darker? What? To understand that day on the trail, we have to rewind to who Rhonda was and the life she was building. Born and raised in Oregon, Rhonda Casto had always been someone who stood out. Strikingly beautiful, yes, but also unusually smart. Friends remember her as the kind of person who could light up a room without trying. She loved books, laughed loud, and had dreams that stretched far beyond the small towns she grew up in. Her goal to become a model, yes, but also to be something more. A provider. A mother. A woman who created a better life for herself and her daughter. When she met Stephen Nichols, she was still young, full of potential. Stephen was older by more than a decade. To some of Rhonda's friends and family, their relationship seemed odd from the start. Stephen had been her tutor originally, quiet, serious man who seemed to know exactly what he wanted. Rhonda's mother, Julia, said later that Stephen was charming in a calculated kind of way. At first, Julia was supportive of their relationship, but over time, she began to sense something wasn't right. Subtle things, like how Stephen isolated Rhonda from old friends. How he always seemed to be in control of the plans, the finances, even the baby. Still, to the outside world, things seemed stable.
Ow.
Rhonda and Stephen lived together, shared parenting responsibilities, and even spoke about marriage. In fact, just weeks before the fatal hike, the two had begun browsing wedding rings and talking about summer plans. Stephen claimed they were more in love than ever. But not everyone believed that. In her private moments, Rhonda confided in her sister and close friends that she wasn't sure about the relationship anymore. She felt Stephen was emotionally distant. She worried he didn't support her career goals. And more than once, she mentioned wanting space to get healthy, focus on herself, maybe even travel with her daughter. The night before the hike, something strange happened. Rhonda made a comment to Stephen that he would later repeat to investigators. She told him, "If anything ever happens to me, take care of our daughter." At the time, Stephen claimed it was part of a larger conversation about Rhonda's body image. She had been feeling down lately. She wasn't sure she could make it as a model. That she was afraid of letting people down. He described her words as emotional, not prophetic. But when authorities revisited that conversation later, it felt eerily like a warning, a clue, something unspoken sitting beneath the surface. On the morning of March 16th, Rhonda, dressed in her hiking gear, strapped their daughter into a carrier on Stephen's back. The couple began their hike on Eagle Creek Trail. It was quiet, empty, and damp from the early morning mist. Cell service was patchy. They passed a few other hikers, but no one remembered anything unusual. Then nothing. No scream. No struggle. Just a sudden fall. That's what Stephen said. He ran to a nearby trailhead, frantic, claiming Rhonda had slipped, that she was gone, that he couldn't reach her. Emergency responders rushed to the scene and found her body more than 100 feet down a cliff. The drop was severe, the terrain slick. At first glance, it was plausible. But then came the questions. Why had Rhonda, an experienced hiker, fallen in a section of the trail she'd been on many times before? Why was there no indication she had tried to stop her fall? No scrapes on her hands, no defensive injuries. And why did Stephen's story shift slightly each time he told it? The autopsy revealed multiple injuries, but none that conclusively proved foul play. The coroner ruled the manner of death as undetermined.
Ow.
It wasn't enough to charge Stephen, not yet, but Rhonda's mother refused to let it go. In the immediate aftermath of Rhonda Casto's death, The community's shock quickly turned into quiet confusion. There was sympathy, yes, but also tension, a sense that something wasn't adding up. Those closest to Rhonda couldn't understand how someone so vibrant, so full of life would simply slip and fall. And the one person who could provide answers, Stephen Nichols wasn't giving the kind of clarity they hoped for. Julia Simmons, Rhonda's mother, refused to stay silent. From day one, Julia had a nagging instinct that this wasn't an accident. Something about Stephen's voice on the phone when he delivered the news. Too calm, too rehearsed. Something about how quickly he pivoted to logistics rather than grief. And something about how Rhonda had been acting in the days before the hike, texting late into the night, asking her mother about getting a new apartment, asking if Julia could watch her daughter more often. In Julia's mind, Rhonda had been planning to leave. And when she started asking questions, the red flags became harder to ignore. She discovered that Stephen had taken out a life insurance policy on Rhonda. Not just a small policy either, but one that would pay out a substantial sum in the event of an accidental death. Julia had no idea this policy existed, and neither did Rhonda's closest friends. It hadn't been mentioned in casual conversation, hadn't come up in any of the couple's financial discussions. And most troubling, Stephen tried to file the claim just weeks after Rhonda died. But there was more. Rhonda's laptop, which she used daily, was missing. Stephen said he didn't know where it was, that she may have taken it hiking for some reason. But Rhonda's sister found that hard to believe. She never brought her laptop outside the house, she told investigators. That thing was her life. She wrote in it every night. Was it possible the device held emails, messages, plans, evidence of Rhonda's state of mind or intentions to leave the relationship? No one could say for sure. The laptop was never recovered. Julia pushed harder. She began documenting everything Stephen's behavior, discrepancies in his statements, even screenshots of past conversations. She met with private investigators, pressed the sheriff's department to re-examine the case, and started posting online, hoping someone might know more. Her desperation was raw, her grief channeled into a relentless pursuit of truth. Stephen, meanwhile, began to distance himself from the family. He moved out of the area, avoided interviews, and refused to answer Julia's questions directly. But what he didn't count on was the paper trail he left behind. Detectives discovered that Stephen had been financially strained in the months leading up to Rhonda's death. He was behind on bills, facing legal pressure from a failed business deal, and recently talked to a friend about getting a fresh start. One friend even reported that Stephen had casually mentioned how an accident would change everything. At first, no one thought much of it, but in retrospect, it felt chilling. Then came the conflicting statements. Stephen told investigators that Rhonda had slipped while reaching for something. Later, he said she had been jogging ahead of him when she lost her footing. And yet, in another version, he claimed she had stopped to take a photo. The inconsistencies weren't dramatic, but they chipped away at his credibility. In interviews, his tone felt detached. Not cold, but clinical. He described Rhonda's final moments like someone recounting a dream they didn't quite believe was real. He never cried during the interviews, never asked about updates, and when offered grief counseling, he declined. Still, the evidence wasn't enough to bring charges. No eyewitness, no confession, no surveillance footage. So the case stalled. But Julia didn't. She reached out to forensic experts, hoping someone could analyze the injuries in greater detail. She spoke to attorneys. She contacted the media. Eventually, her voice reached the ears of an investigative journalist from Portland, someone who had covered cold cases before and knew how to dig into a story that the system had buried. And that's when everything began to change. The journalist uncovered court documents revealing that Stephen had also been involved in a separate lawsuit around the time of Rhonda's death, one involving a former girlfriend, who accused him of controlling behavior and psychological abuse. Though it never led to criminal charges, it painted a disturbing picture of someone who may have had a pattern. Suddenly, Rhonda's story wasn't just about a fall on a hiking trail. It was about trust, control, money, and what happens when a quiet manipulator thinks no one is watching. For years, Rhonda Cousteau's case remained dormant, not closed, not forgotten, but frozen in a painful limbo. Her name slipped out of headlines. The trail where she fell became quiet again, the questions surrounding her death fading into whispers. But not for her mother, not for Julia Simmons. her pursuit never wavered. She continued collecting statements, organizing case notes, and keeping pressure on law enforcement to re-examine the circumstances. And then, in 2014, 5 years after Rhonda's death, something unexpected happened. Stephen Nichols left the United States. Without much explanation, Stephen moved to China, reportedly to teach English. At first, his departure didn't raise many alarms. He was a single father by then, still raising the daughter he and Rhonda had shared. But to Julie and eventually to investigators, it looked like something more. An escape. The local DA's office took notice. Unresolved suspicions and mounting evidence that had once felt just shy of prosecutable now seemed more urgent, more actionable. After all, Stephen had fled voluntarily or not, it looked like avoidance. Behind the scenes, momentum began to build. The Oregon State Police reviewed the file again, this time with fresh eyes, new technology, and a willingness to revisit their initial conclusions. They reassessed the medical examiner's report, noting subtle injuries that didn't entirely align with a simple fall. Scrapes inconsistent with tumbling, bruises in places that suggested restraint. There were still gaps, but the case was shifting. What made things truly move forward was Stephen's behavior abroad. In China, he began a relationship with a new partner. And disturbingly, some of the same patterns emerged: manipulation, controlling tendencies, sudden disappearances. One incident in particular alarmed authorities. Stephen was accused of trying to manipulate his partner into signing over financial access. When she refused, the relationship deteriorated, and she reported him to the local consulate. The pattern was too close for comfort. Law enforcement in Oregon now had what they needed to make a move. In 2015, 6 years after Rhonda's death, a grand jury quietly convened. It was based on a growing body of circumstantial evidence: Stephen's suspicious relocation and the lingering inconsistencies in his story. And for the first time since that foggy morning on the trail, Stephen Nichols was indicted for the death of Rhonda Casto. An arrest warrant was issued, but there was one problem. Stephen was still overseas. That set off a legal process involving international cooperation. U.S. authorities worked with Chinese officials to locate Stephen. By 2016, he was detained and extradited back to the United States. The moment Julia had waited for, prayed for, had finally come. Stephen would stand trial for Rhonda's death. When he arrived in Oregon, the media lit up. Cameras waited at the courthouse. Old neighbors gave interviews. Rhonda's friends re-emerged to tell their stories. And through it all, Stephen remained silent. No press statements. No apologies. Just the same emotionless calm that had unnerved everyone from day one. The case was now in the public spotlight again. It was just Rhonda's story that captivated people. It was the idea that justice might still be possible even after nearly a decade. That sometimes the system could course correct. But the legal battle was far from over. Stephen's attorneys moved quickly. They challenged the extradition, the timeline of the investigation, even the credibility of Julia's activism. They argued that the evidence was entirely circumstantial, that there was no proof beyond a reasonable doubt that this was anything other than a tragic accident. What made the case even more difficult was time. Key witnesses had moved. Memories had faded. The terrain where Rhonda fell had changed slightly due to erosion and maintenance. Still, prosecutors pressed on. In a shocking twist, just before the trial was set to begin, Stephen made an unexpected offer. A plea deal. He would plead guilty to criminally negligent homicide, lesser charge than murder in exchange for a reduced sentence. The plea acknowledged that Rhonda's death was not purely accidental, but it stopped short of admitting intent. It was, by legal standards, a compromise. For Julia, it was not the justice she dreamed of, but it was accountability. Stephen was sentenced to just under 3 years in prison, most of which he had already served while awaiting trial. He would be released shortly after sentencing, free to rebuild his life. Julia stood on the courthouse steps that day and addressed the reporters. "No sentence could ever bring my daughter back," she said. "But the truth matters. Rhonda mattered." And now the world knows that what happened to her was not an accident. It was a choice. The courthouse emptied. The cameras stopped rolling. The reporters packed up their gear and drove off, chasing the next story. But for Julia Simmons, that day marked the beginning of something even more painful than the wait for justice. It marked the reality of living with it. Stephen Nichols had accepted the plea. The words were on the record. Guilty, yet the consequences, at least in Julia's eyes, felt far too light. Less than 3 years for the death of her only daughter. Time served, and freedom waiting on the other side. The gavel had fallen, but nothing felt finished. If anything, it felt like everything had just been paused, like grief had been put in a glass box and labeled handled, even though the wound was still wide open. But even in that moment, Julia refused to retreat into bitterness. Instead, she turned toward the one person who needed her, the most, Rhonda's daughter. The little girl had been just 9 months old when her mother died. She was too young to understand what had happened, too small to carry any of the weight. But as she grew, so did the questions. Why is Grandma so sad sometimes? Why aren't there many photos of Mommy and Daddy together? Why do people whisper when they talk about us? Julia chose honesty, but not bluntness. She told her granddaughter that her mother was brave, beautiful, and wanted more for her life than what she had. That she loved her daughter fiercely. She had been hurt by someone who was supposed to protect her. But most importantly, she made sure Rhonda's spirit was never forgotten. She turned the guest bedroom into a memory space, a wall of framed photographs. Drawings, notes, even Rhonda's old favorite scarf, hanging from a hook like a quiet hello from the past. But while Julia was focused on raising Rhonda's daughter with love, she also began channeling her grief outward. She knew her story wasn't unique. Too many families had walked the same path: sodden loss, suspicions unproven, justice delayed or diluted, so she launched a foundation in Rhonda's name. Its mission? To raise awareness about emotional abuse, to advocate for legal reform around coercive control, and to fund safety initiatives for women trying to leave dangerous relationships. The organization started small, just Julia, a few volunteers, and a handful of donors. But something about her story resonated. Soon, she was invited to speak at college campuses, police academies, and women's shelters across the country. One of her most powerful speeches came just a year after the trial, during a domestic violence awareness panel in Portland. Julia stood in front of hundreds of people, holding Rhonda's journal in her hands. She didn't write about fear, she said, wrote about hope, about wanting more, about trusting that she could change her life. That's what makes what happened so unbearable, because when she finally found the courage to believe in her future, it was stolen from her. The room was silent, no phones buzzing, no shifting in chairs, just the weight of one mother's voice cutting through a crowd of strangers. As the years passed, Rhonda's story began showing up in classrooms, training manuals, and podcasts. Her name became part of the national conversation around invisible abuse, the kind that doesn't leave bruises but chips away at self-worth and safety over time. But there was still one question that remained unanswered, one that gnawed at Julia in quiet moments. What would Rhonda think of all this? Would she want her story told in this way? Would she be proud of how her daughter was being raised? Would she forgive Julia for not saving her in time? Those questions don't have clear answers. But Julia believes that if her daughter were watching, she'd understand. She'd see the love behind the pain, the fight behind the tears. The legacy built not from vengeance, but from purpose. Meanwhile, the man at the center of it all, Stephen Nichols, lives a quiet life. He's kept a low profile since his release. No interviews, no statements, no apology. His whereabouts are known only to a few, and perhaps that's for the best. Rhonda's daughter is now in middle school. She loves to read. She's curious about the world. She knows her mother's story, not all the dark details, but the truth wrapped in gentleness. And she knows that her mother mattered, that her life had meaning, that she was loved fiercely, even in her absence. The path forward hasn't been easy. But step by step, mile by mile, Julia and her granddaughter walk it together. Just like Rhonda did that day on Eagle Creek. Only now, there's no one to push them down. Only the wind, the sky, and the memory of a woman who deserved so much more. Rhonda Costo's story may never feel truly finished. There are still questions, moments lost to time, and words never spoken. But what remains is her memory, a young mother full of dreams. A life that mattered, and a family that never gave up searching for the truth. Her story is a reminder that what happens behind closed doors, in quiet conversations, and in the spaces no one sees can shape everything. It's a reminder that justice doesn't always arrive in the form we hope for. Sometimes it's a mother's voice refusing to be silenced. Sometimes it's a daughter growing up knowing her mother was more than a headline. If Rhonda's story moved you, taught you something, or made you pause, please take a moment to support this video. Like it, so it reaches others who need to hear it. Comment below with your thoughts. We read every single one. Share this with someone who believes in truth and justice. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you never miss the next episode. Because every story matters. Some stories, like Rhonda's, deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.